What would you do if you had nowhere left to turn, and the only escape from your past was to run? Paul Foster's life had come to a breaking point, and he found himself trapped in a place so isolated, even the harshest wilderness couldn't match the dark corners of his own mind. This is the story of a man who lost everything, his marriage, his career, his dignity, and fled to the edge of the world, where survival itself became his only hope. But when you're running from yourself, can you ever truly escape? As the cold winds howled outside and the night stretched endlessly over the frozen landscape, Paul's only choice was to keep moving. But out there, in the remote, unforgiving wild, something much darker awaited him than he could have ever imagined. How did he end up in the harshest place on earth, hiding from a life he had destroyed? And could he survive when the truth began to catch up with him in the most unexpected way? Welcome back, dear viewers, and if you're new to our channel, a very warm welcome. Get ready for a gripping story full of twists, suspense, and a journey unlike any other. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button to join us on these real-life inspired journeys every day. And, for those who've been following, we'd love to hear from you. Let us know where you're watching from in the comments. Paul's life wasn't always this way. At 35, he had it all, until it slipped through his fingers. His marriage was falling apart. His job was hanging by a thread. His once bright future now seemed buried in a haze of alcohol, regret, and bad choices. His only option? Escape. He thought he could outrun his mistakes. But could anyone? And would he survive the journey, not just physically, but mentally, too? It all began on a cold November night. Paul had been drinking away his regrets, drowning in the decisions that led him to this point. Every sip, a temporary escape from the wreckage of his life. The whiskey burned his throat, a fleeting relief from the storm raging inside his mind. But with each drink, the haze grew thicker, and reality became less and less clear. Nothing ever lasted, not the numbness, not the fleeting sense of control. Just more mistakes piling up in the dark corners of his mind. The night was bitter cold. He could feel it in his bones, even as he poured the amber liquid into his glass. The sharp burn of whiskey hit his throat, a fleeting relief from the emotional storm inside. But it was only temporary, a band-aid for a wound that wouldn't heal. The warm sensation spread across his chest as the alcohol kicked in, but the pain, oh, the pain, never left. It lingered in the background, just waiting to resurface, waiting for the moment when the alcohol would wear off and the regret would come crashing back down. The TV flickered softly in the background as Paul sank deeper into the couch, his mind slipping into darkness. His head felt heavy, and his thoughts were as scattered as the debris from a broken life. He'd lost his job, his wife, his sense of direction. All he had left was this apartment, a few empty bottles, and the weight of every bad decision he had ever made. When Paul woke up, the weight of his hangover was the least of his worries. His head throbbed painfully, a dull ache that spread across his skull, pulsing with every beat of his heart. His mouth was dry, his body stiff from the awkward position he'd slept in, but it was the blinking lights of the TV that pulled him from his fog. He didn't even realize it at first, but the image on the screen was unmistakable. A store had been ransacked, shelves overturned, glass shattered, and the wreckage of a crime that had shaken the local community. But as the camera zoomed in on the grainy CCTV footage, Paul's stomach dropped. There, on the screen, in the middle of the chaos, was a man. A figure standing amidst the wreckage, wild-eyed and disheveled, staring directly into the camera. And it was him. It was Paul. His face. His eyes. But he didn't remember it. He couldn't. The destruction was his doing, but he had no memory of it. The scene played out in front of him, a nightmare he had no recollection of creating. The voice of the news anchor was a distant hum in his ears as he stared at the screen, trying to piece together the fragments of the night that had led him here. His breath caught in his throat as the reality began to sink in. He wasn't just watching this from the outside, he was the one who destroyed everything. His mind raced, but it couldn't catch up with his emotions. The shame. The fear. The terror. Was this his fault? Had he really done this? And why couldn't he remember? The moment the camera zoomed in on his face, Paul felt something shift deep inside. Something that had been buried under years of regret and numbness started to stir: guilt, shame, and the undeniable realization that he couldn't run from this anymore. The screen flickered as Paul's vision blurred, the weight of his decisions crashing down on him. He couldn't escape the past anymore. It had found him. His face was everywhere. The destruction. The chaos. His fault. There was no going back. The weight of his mistakes pressed against him, suffocating him, leaving him no room to breathe. For a moment, he wondered if running had ever really been an option. And now, what could he do? What was left to lose? As he sat there, frozen in place, the reality of his situation sunk in. He had no idea what had happened the night before. All he knew was that the man on that screen wasn't some stranger. It was him. And the damage he had caused, he couldn't undo it. His marriage, his job, his dignity, all gone in one blurry, reckless night. His life was over. Or was it? Could he still fix this? Could he survive what came next? Only one thing was certain: Paul was no longer running from his past. It had finally caught up to him. Staring at the blurry footage on the screen, Paul's heart began to race uncontrollably. His stomach twisted, and his palms grew clammy. The man in the video was him, no question. But the image felt like it belonged to a different person, someone he didn't recognize. He had no memory of the destruction, the chaos, none of it. All he knew was that the repercussions were coming for him fast. His wife had already kicked him out, his job was gone, and now, the police were after him. The weight of his decisions was suffocating. He felt his chest tighten with every beat of his heart, as though the walls were closing in on him. The regret, the guilt, it was all too much. But instead of facing it, of facing the consequences, he did what came most naturally to him: he ran. He always ran. And it seemed that running was the only thing he could do now. He looked at the TV, but the words on the screen didn't register anymore. His mind was elsewhere, panicked thoughts racing as he tried to find a way out. He could still hear Mary Lynn's voice in his ears, the hurt and disbelief that had filled her words when she had told him to leave. How could he ever face her again? How could he explain what he had become? His marriage, the life they'd built together, was shattered, and all because of his own weakness. His eyes turned back to the screen. The CCTV footage showed him standing in the wreckage, eyes wide, wild, and confused. He didn't even know how he got there. Was it a blur of bad choices? Or something more? His mind snapped back to the present. He had nothing left but the clothes on his back and the overwhelming need to run. He couldn't stay here, he couldn't face the police, the shame, the ruin he had created. His life was a mess, and there was only one thing left to do. With his heart pounding, Paul grabbed his jacket and stormed out of the apartment, the flickering light of the TV still casting shadows behind him. He didn't know where he was going, he just knew that he had to get away. He couldn't think straight, couldn't see the way forward, but he had to try. He bought a bus ticket, one way, north, destination unknown. A ticket to nowhere, to a life he hoped he could outrun. But where did a man go when his past had caught up with him? How far could he run before the truth found him? The bus rumbled down the road, and Paul sank into his seat, staring out the window at the darkening sky. With every mile, he felt more detached from everything he once knew. The city, the streets, his past, none of it mattered anymore. All that existed now was the cold road ahead and the sound of the bus tires humming against the asphalt. As the bus continued its journey north, the world outside grew more desolate. The streets faded into the vast, empty landscape. The loneliness that Paul had once felt deep inside seemed to grow with every passing mile. The cold gnawed at his bones, but it was the fear inside him that hurt the most. It wasn't just the police he was running from. He was running from everything he had done, from his past mistakes, his failures, the people he had let down. It wasn't just the law that wanted him, it was the guilt that had been haunting him for years, now closing in like a storm he couldn't outrun. As the miles stretched on, Paul couldn't shake the thought, could he ever escape what he had done? The farther north he went, the more isolated he felt. The cold felt like a physical barrier, a line between him and the life he was leaving behind. But there was no safety in running. The fear inside him was far more dangerous than the icy roads outside. Every few hours, he stopped at a gas station, bought some coffee, and kept moving. There was no plan, no destination, just an endless journey into the unknown. And the deeper he went, the more lost he felt, like a man fading into the vast, dark landscape that stretched before him. He had been drinking to forget the pain, but now, he was sober, and the fear was worse than ever. He thought about his wife again, Mary Lynn. Would she even recognize him when this was all over? Would she ever want to? The question circled in his mind, gnawing at him with every passing hour. He had lost everything. Was there anything left to run to? By the time Paul reached the small, desolate town of Barrow, he was barely recognizable. His clothes were ragged, his shoes worn thin from the journey, and his body, battered by the unforgiving cold, ached with exhaustion. The wind bit through his layers, but he barely felt it anymore. His mind was numb, focused only on putting one foot in front of the other. There was no plan anymore, just survival. But as the cold kept pressing, he found a sliver of hope in the form of a man who approached him with a knowing smile. The man, tall and broad, with a weathered face that spoke of years spent battling the elements, introduced himself as Big Fellow. His voice was rough, yet oddly comforting, and his eyes held a sharpness that made Paul uneasy, and intrigued at the same time. "You looking for work?" the big fellow asked, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his thick coat, his breath visible in the frigid air. Without waiting for a reply, the big fellow nodded towards a towering structure in the distance. "We got work at the warehouse, just outside of town. Come with me." The warehouse was his offer, his lifeline. Paul wasn't in a position to refuse. Desperate for a way to keep moving, he followed, the weight of his decision pressing down on him. The warehouse stood like a monolith against the snow-covered landscape, the sound of the wind howling in the background as Paul walked inside. It was enormous, almost impossibly so. The cold seeped through the walls, and there was a silence inside that felt unnatural, as though the building itself was holding its breath. The faint hum of machinery echoed through the vast space, but there was no warmth here, no life. Just rows upon rows of containers and boxes, stacked high and reaching into the darkness beyond. Paul didn't care what the place was or what it did. At that moment, all he wanted was to work, to blend in, to stay off the radar. He was tired of running and just wanted the chance to breathe without fear of being caught. But as he walked through the cavernous space, something about the warehouse unsettled him. There was an odd stillness, a heaviness in the air. The workers, dressed in dull uniforms, moved with purpose but didn't speak. Their faces were worn, hollow, like they had given up on the world outside. And the deeper Paul got into the warehouse, the more he felt the weight of their silence pressing in on him. They were all strangers here. Each one running from something, just like him. The big fellow led Paul through the rows of crates, his footsteps steady and confident. He never said much, but the look in his eyes told Paul all he needed to know. This wasn't just a job. Something more was going on here, something Paul couldn't quite grasp but knew, deep down, wasn't good. The big fellow didn't ask questions, didn't care who Paul was, where he'd come from, or what kind of life he had lived before arriving here. The absence of inquiry was oddly reassuring, but also disturbing. He was treated like any other man who'd wandered in looking for shelter, looking for a fresh start. As the days passed, Paul began to notice the strange dynamics in the warehouse. The workers were different from what he had expected. They kept to themselves, never making eye contact or exchanging words. They were all focused on their tasks, but there was an air of secrecy around them. The more Paul observed, the more he realized that there was something off about this place, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. The big fellow was always there, leading by example. He wasn't a man of many words, but his presence was commanding. He was calm, collected, and didn't seem to care about the oddities around him. Paul, however, couldn't shake the feeling that he was part of something much larger than a simple job. The warehouse wasn't just a place for labor, it was a place for people like him. People who had no past, no questions, no future to speak of. They were just existing, day by day, like a strange, silent army that never questioned their purpose. The more Paul stayed, the more he felt a connection to these people. They were like ghosts, drifting through the motions of life, running from something or hiding from something. Some of them, he noticed, had strange marks on their arms, tattoos that seemed out of place in such a sterile environment. Others had deep lines in their faces, the kind that only come from years of regret, years of running. Paul began to wonder just how many others were here, just like him, trying to escape the world they'd left behind. But the longer he worked here, the more he realized that there was no escaping this place. It was a prison of its own kind, and he had walked right into it. It was just another night at the warehouse. The usual hum of machinery, the clatter of distant workers, and the cold that seemed to seep through the walls and into the very bones of the building. Paul was finishing his shift, his mind distracted by thoughts of escape, of running, but he didn't expect tonight to be any different. That's when it happened. The lights flickered once, then twice. A low hum vibrated through the building, and for a moment, Paul thought it was just another malfunction, something routine. But then the lights went out completely. And the warehouse fell into complete darkness. The silence was deafening. No hum of the machines. No sound from the workers. Just the cold, suffocating stillness. Paul froze, his heart pounding in his chest as his eyes struggled to adjust to the blackness around him. Then, a soft sound broke the silence. A scraping noise, like something heavy dragging across the floor. He held his breath, straining to hear, his senses heightened. And then, from the depths of the darkness, he heard the unmistakable sound of movement, shuffling, scraping, like something, or someone, was out there with him. Paul's pulse quickened as shapes began to materialize in the dim light. The shadows flickered and shifted, but they weren't just shadows. They were moving, creeping closer. And in that moment, Paul realized, he wasn't alone in the warehouse. His mind raced as his eyes tried to make sense of the shapes. They were large, too large, and their movements were slow, deliberate. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but his feet were frozen in place, as though the cold had taken root in his bones. A distant scraping sound echoed again, closer this time, and Paul's breath caught in his throat. A faint, unnatural glow from the dim light outside the warehouse door caught the edge of one of the creatures. Paul could barely make it out, but there was something unmistakably wrong about it. The creature's body was unnaturally thin, its pale skin stretched tight over bones that seemed too sharp. Its eyes were wide, unnaturally bloodshot, and its movements were jerky, like it wasn't entirely sure how to move in its own body. As it inched closer, Paul's senses screamed in terror. The creature's eyes met his, and a chill ran down his spine. They were intelligent eyes, too intelligent for anything that should exist in this world. They watched him, calculated. And then it moved, faster than he could react, disappearing into the shadows once more. But Paul knew it hadn't gone far. It was circling, waiting, studying him from the dark. More sounds filled the air, scraping, shuffling, clicking. And then came the low, guttural breathing. It echoed off the cold, metal walls of the warehouse, filling the space with a sense of dread that clung to Paul's skin like ice. His breath came in shallow gasps as the creatures closed in, their presence undeniable. The truth hit him like a ton of bricks. These weren't animals. They weren't anything he had seen before. These creatures were not of this world, at least not in any way he could understand. They were pale, hairless, their bodies twisted and thin, like they'd been carved from the dark itself. Their movements were unnatural, almost as if they were too aware of their surroundings, too precise in their actions. This was no animal. This was something else. The creatures circled the warehouse, their wide eyes glinting in the half-light as they stalked the edges of the building. Every time Paul moved, they followed, always keeping just out of reach of the light, always watching. He could hear them breathing, low and harsh, like they were hungry, and Paul was their prey. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end as he realized what they were, what they could be. He had no explanation, no way to understand what was happening, but he knew one thing for sure: he wasn't safe. Not here. Not now. And they were closing in. Paul took a step backward, his body trembling, but his feet wouldn't move fast enough. Another creature came into view, its eyes glowing faintly as it crept towards him. And then, with a sudden movement, it lunged forward, only to retreat as the light from the far corner caught it in its path. The creatures seemed to fear the light, but only just enough to keep their distance. It was the only thing keeping Paul alive, and it was beginning to flicker. The warehouse was a battlefield now. The creatures were everywhere, creeping out of the darkness, their eyes glowing with an eerie intensity. The air was thick with tension, and every second felt like an eternity. Paul's hands trembled as he fumbled with the control panel, desperately trying to restore the lights. The sound of the creatures moving in the shadows was deafening, the scratching of their claws against the cold concrete floor sending a chill through his spine. Behind him, the big fellow and Scar Cheek were fighting back. Their movements were swift, practiced, as they held the creatures at bay, their bodies blocking the path to the control panel. The big fellow's deep voice echoed in the chaos. "Keep going, Paul," he shouted, his tone firm but strained as he swung at one of the creatures that lunged too close. "We don't have much time." Paul's heart was pounding in his chest, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He knew that his one chance to survive, his one chance to get out of this, was tied to that switch. But every time he reached for the panel, the creatures drew closer, their movements synchronized, as if they were hunting him. His fingers shook violently as he tried to steady himself, the noise of the creatures getting louder with each passing second. He couldn't afford to hesitate, not now. Paul's mind raced. Should he turn and help the big fellow and Scar Cheek, or should he focus on the switch? His moral compass told him he should fight, but his survival instincts screamed that if he didn't act now, they were all doomed. The room felt like it was closing in on him, the air thick with fear and desperation. One choice, one action, could mean the difference between life and death, not just for him, but for everyone. His hand finally found the switch. In that moment, it was as if everything in the warehouse stopped. Time seemed to slow, and for a brief instant, Paul was able to focus. He took a deep breath and, with all his strength, flipped the switch. The lights roared back to life, flooding the warehouse with a blinding brightness that pushed back the darkness, revealing the creatures in their full form. For a split second, the creatures recoiled, their pale bodies flinching from the harsh light as if they had been caught in a trap. They snarled, their claws twitching, but the light was too powerful. The warehouse was no longer their domain. With a final hiss, the creatures turned and scrambled back into the shadows, retreating from the blinding glare. The room seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief as the immediate danger passed, the warehouse now bathed in the steady, unforgiving light. Paul stood there, breathing heavily, his heart still pounding in his chest. He had survived. But the cost of his survival, his fear, his choices, lingered in the air, heavy and unresolved. As the warehouse settled into an uneasy calm, Paul turned slowly, his body still shaking from the adrenaline. He could hear the big fellow and Scar Cheek moving behind him, their breaths deep but steady, their silence as loud as the chaos that had just unfolded. The creatures were gone, but something inside Paul remained. The darkness outside had been beaten back, but what about the darkness inside him? What about the part of him that had run away from every responsibility, every mistake? The terror of the night, the fight for survival, had masked it, just like the creatures had been driven back by the light. But now, in the quiet aftermath, Paul couldn't escape the truth. He had faced the night. He had survived. But was this really a victory? The fear, the guilt, the shame, it was still there, buried beneath the surface, lurking just out of reach. He had escaped the creatures, but could he ever escape himself? Paul stood there in the middle of the warehouse, breathing heavily, his heart still racing. The light around him was harsh, unrelenting. The creatures had retreated into the darkness. But as Paul stood in the center of that blinding light, he knew one thing for certain: the biggest battle he had left to face was the one inside his own mind. And for the first time in a long time, Paul wondered, if he could survive this, could he ever truly survive himself? If you're enjoying this journey so far, don't forget to give us a like, share with your friends, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring more real-life inspired stories just like this to life every day. And we'd love to hear from you. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below and let us know the time where you are, and what you think of Paul's journey so far. Your thoughts and engagement mean the world to us. Thank you for staying with us through this intense story. We hope it keeps you on the edge of your seat, just as it did us. Stay tuned, because the journey is far from over. And remember, your next adventure might be just a click away. See you in the next one.